Мені не все одно, щоб партнери про нас щось зайве подумали. А ми абсолютно чесні, відкриті. Я не хочу співпадінь. І тому я не поїду в Саудівську Аравію.
Если Зеленский говорит, что с ним можно вести переговоры, ну, дает понять, с ним можно вести переговоры, на мой взгляд.
Вести переговоры можно с кем угодно, только в силу своей нелегитимности он не имеет права ничего подписывать.
Power is rarely about who holds the most weapons. It's about who gets to sit at the table. And right now, in Riyadh, a table has been set, but Ukraine and Europe is nowhere to be seen. In a stunning turn of events, the United States and Russia have entered direct peace negotiations to end the war in Ukraine without Ukraine itself. Europe has also been left out. The fate of an entire region is being decided behind closed doors, with the key players locked outside. So what's really going on here? Why is the West, once united against Russian aggression, suddenly cutting its own allies out of the equation? On February 18th, 2025, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and National Security Advisor Mike Waltz met Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. This marks the first direct, high-level peace talks between Washington and Moscow since the war began nearly 3 years ago. The goal? A ceasefire and a possible roadmap to normalize diplomatic relations. The problem? Neither Ukraine nor any European power was invited. The talks were arranged by Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who has been pushing for a greater global diplomatic role. But the exclusion of Ukraine has raised immediate alarms, with President Volodymyr Zelenskyy openly denouncing the negotiations as an illegitimate power grab. Zelenskyy has made one thing crystal clear: Ukraine will not accept any deal made without its direct involvement. But, as Putin said, he has no power to make any deals, so who should we trust?
Do you have any message for Ukrainians who, after 3 years of fighting, might feel betrayed or disappointed at not having a seat at these initial talks in Saudi Arabia?
Well, I think I'm really disappointed. I hear that, they're upset about not having a seat. Well, they've had a seat for 3 years and a long time before that. This could have been settled very easily. Just a half-baked negotiator could have settled this years ago. So when they're worried about not being seated, you mean somebody that should have gone in and made a deal a long time ago? You could have made a deal. This is one that could have made a deal. There was no talk of this during the Trump administration. Putin would have never, ever done it. And I think I have the power to end this war. And I think it's going very well. But today I heard, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal. I could have made a deal for Ukraine. You've been hearing now Europe is saying, well, I think we're going to go in and we're going to go. All of a sudden, you're going to end up in World War III over something that should have never happened.
The exclusion of Ukraine isn't just a diplomatic slight. It's a seismic shift in how this war is being handled. For the past 3 years, Ukraine has relied on U.S. and European military aid, intelligence support, and economic backing. But now, the nation that promised to stand with Ukraine are negotiating with its invader behind its back. So why is the U.S. doing this? Why risk alienating an ally it has invested billions in defending? Well, the short answer is that presidents had changed, and Trump doesn't want no more war, according to him. So cutting down the aids will have Ukraine on the line and accepting any ceasefire agreement that comes. But why is Europe so enraged also? Why do they want to keep the war going? French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz have publicly condemned the talks. Italy, Poland, and the Baltic states have also denounced the move, calling it a dangerous precedent. Armin Papperger, CEO of Rheinmetall, Germany's largest defense contractor, put it bluntly: Europe has been relegated to the kids' table in global security. For decades, the U.S. has called on Europe to step up its defense spending. Now, when Europe actually needs to be part of the conversation, Washington has locked it out. But why? Because the U.S. is tired of waiting. Behind closed doors, sources in Washington say there's growing frustration with Ukraine's lack of progress. Despite massive military aid, Ukraine hasn't delivered the decisive victories the West had hoped for. And as the 2025 U.S. elections draw closer, political pressure is mounting. The American public, already weary of costly foreign wars, wants an exit strategy. This might be it. The Trump administration's approach is clear: end the war fast. Avoid long-term entanglement. Keep Russia from fully aligning with China, but at what cost? Is this a diplomatic masterstroke or a betrayal of Ukraine and NATO? If Ukraine and Europe are left out of the peace deal, What does that mean for NATO's future? And more importantly, what is Russia demanding in return? Vladimir Putin is not negotiating from a position of weakness. Despite heavy sanctions, battlefield losses, and international isolation, Russia still holds one massive advantage: time. While Ukraine burns through Western-supplied weapons and financial aid, Russia's war machine keeps grinding forward. Moscow has adapted to sanctions, rerouted its economy, and secured key allies in China, Iran, and North Korea. And now, it's sitting at the table with the most powerful nation in the world, without Ukraine to challenge its demands. So according to some reports, Putin's top demands include recognition of Russian control over occupied Ukrainian territories, a halt to NATO expansion, particularly blocking Ukraine and Georgia from ever joining, lifting key Western sanctions on Russian energy and financial institutions. In other words, Russia wants to win this war at the negotiating table, even if it couldn't win it on the battlefield. Some of these demands are completely unacceptable, but others, they might actually be on the table. Let's break it down. Territorial recognition. Handing over Ukrainian land would be a wild move for any U.S. administration. But that doesn't mean Washington won't push Ukraine to accept a ceasefire in place, which would effectively freeze the conflict with Russia still holding large chunks of Ukrainian territory. This is exactly what happened in Korea in 1953 and Cyprus in 1974. Wars that never formally ended, but where the fighting stopped. If the U.S. sells this as peace with conditions, would Ukraine have a choice? NATO expansion. Ukraine joining NATO has been a red line for Russia since day one, and while the U.S. won't publicly abandon Ukraine's NATO aspirations, privately, that's already happening. Think about it. Finland and Sweden joined NATO in record time. Ukraine? It's still waiting, because everyone knows admitting Ukraine while it's at war would trigger an instant NATO-Russia conflict. Would Washington quietly shelve Ukraine's NATO hopes in exchange for a ceasefire? That's a real possibility. Sanctions. Here's where things get tricky. The U.S. doesn't need to lift all sanctions, but some of them, that's already happening. Europe is still buying Russian LNG. India and China are importing record amounts of Russian oil. The Russian ruble, though struggling, hasn't collapsed. If the U.S. agrees to ease restrictions on Russian banking or energy sales, Putin could frame this as a massive victory, without the U.S. officially admitting defeat. The U.S. stops supplying weapons and money, Ukraine's ability to fight collapses overnight. Except, it's already happening. In the past 6 months, U.S. military aid to Ukraine has slowed to a trickle compared to 2022 and 2023 levels. Meanwhile, the Pentagon is shifting focus toward the Indo-Pacific, a clear sign that Washington is preparing for a future war with China, not a never-ending fight in Ukraine. If the U.S. walks away from Ukraine, Europe is screwed. Let's be brutally honest. Without U.S. military aid, Europe cannot sustain Ukraine. Germany's ammunition stockpiles, depleted. France's military production, years behind schedule. Poland and the Baltic states, loud supporters of Ukraine, but with limited military muscle. The UK, already cutting its own defense budget. This is exactly why European leaders are freaking out. They know that if Washington pulls back, the entire burden of supporting Ukraine falls on them, and they are not ready for that. But let's say Zelenskyy refuses to accept a U.S.-Russia brokered ceasefire. What then? Then Ukraine would be on its own. And if U.S. military aid stops completely, Ukraine's ability to keep fighting would crumble within months. Air defenses would run out of missiles. The army would be forced into retreat. It's a brutal reality, but one that Washington and Moscow understand perfectly. Vladimir Putin has been playing this war like a chess match. He doesn't need to win on the battlefield. He just needs to outlast Western patience. And now, that strategy is paying off. The U.S. is desperate for an exit. Europe is in panic mode. Ukraine is running out of options. This isn't just about military tactics anymore. This is raw geopolitical power at play. If this deal goes through, it won't just reshape Ukraine. It will redefine NATO itself. So the real question is, what happens when an alliance built on unity starts falling apart? You see, NATO was built on one core principle. An attack on one is an attack on all. That's why it survived the Cold War and the Balkan conflicts. But if the U.S. cuts a backdoor deal with Russia, without NATO's full support, that principle is dead. Think about it. Poland and the Baltic states have spent billions preparing for a future Russian threat. If Washington suddenly decides, let's just freeze the war and give Putin what he wants, do you really think they'll trust the U.S. to defend them next? France and Germany have already been fighting over military strategy. If NATO can't agree on how to handle Ukraine, what happens when another crisis hits? The cracks are already there. This deal, it could shatter NATO's unity once and for all.